There are three main theories to motivation. Think of today's presentation as three stops along our moving delivery route. At each stop, I'll first explain a motivation theory, then I'll show how I applied that theory through real experiences, and finally, I'll discuss how teachers can use these ideas in their own classrooms. The first stop is expectancy value theory, which focuses on whether someone believes they can succeed and whether they believe a task is worth the effort. The second stop is causal attribution theory, which looks at how people explain success and failure and how those explanations influence future motivation. Finally, goal orientation theory, which explore the different reasons students can engage in learning and how teachers can create classrooms that encourage lifelong learning rather than simply chasing grades. By the end of our journey, I hope you'll see that motivation isn't about finding one perfect strategy. Instead, it's about understanding why someone is stuck so we can choose the right strategy to help them move forward. There are three main theories to motivation. Think of today's presentation as three stops along our moving delivery route. At each stop, I'll first explain a motivation theory, then I'll show how I applied that theory through real experiences, and finally, I'll discuss how teachers can use these ideas in their own classrooms. The first stop is expectancy value theory, which focuses on whether someone believes they can succeed and whether they believe a task is worth the effort. The second stop is causal attribution theory, which looks at how people explain success and failure and how those explanations influence future motivation. Finally, goal orientation theory, which explore the different reasons students can engage in learning and how teachers can create classrooms that encourage lifelong learning rather than simply chasing grades. By the end of our journey, I hope you'll see that motivation isn't about finding one perfect strategy. Instead, it's about understanding why someone is stuck so we can choose the right strategy to help them move forward. In our first route stop, we'll discuss the expectancy value theory. Expectancy value theory, developed by psychologist John Atkinson in the 1950s, was further adapted by Eccles and Wigfield in the 1980s. They said that people who already believe they will succeed at a task have a higher likelihood of being motivated to complete the task. The theory suggests that motivation depends on two important questions. The first question is, can I do this? This is called expectancy. If someone believes they have the skills, knowledge, or ability to succeed, they're much more likely to attempt the task. On the other hand, if they believe they're destined to fail, even an important task may feel impossible. The second question is this worth doing? This is called value. Even if someone is fully capable of succeeding, they still may not be motivated if they don't see any purpose or importance in the task. The theory is broken into four internal and external categories: intrinsic value, attainment value, utility, and cost. Okay, let's talk about the four categories that influence motivation in this theory. The first is intrinsic value, which refers to how enjoyable or interesting a task is. For example, a student who enjoys reading may choose to read simply because they enjoy it. Next is utility value or usefulness. Students often become more motivated when they understand how a lesson connects to their future goals or everyday lives. This was one of the strategies I intentionally used during my first act of motivation, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. The third category is cost. Cost includes the effort, time, stress, or sacrifices associated with completing a task. Even if students recognize a task's value, they may still avoid it if they believe the cost is simply too high. Finally, there's attainment value, which relates to personal identity. Students are motivated because succeeding reflects who they want to be. A child who sees themselves as a good artist may work especially hard on an art project because it reinforces that identity. As teachers, understanding these four types of value allows us to ask an important question. How does a student find value in this specific task? Once we identify that missing piece, we can choose strategies that make learning more meaningful and more achievable. So, what does this theory actually look like in real life? During the first phase of our active motivation projects, I had the opportunity to apply these ideas while helping motivate a family member through a very emotional life transition. In April, my grandfather passed away. It was very unexpected, as he was fairly fit despite being in his 80s. Aside from this situation being sad for the whole family, it also created a cause and effect scenario that was really serious. You see, my granddad was my Nana's caretaker. She's been in poor health for years, and we have spent the better part of a decade asking them to move out of the house they've lived in since 1987 to somewhere with better accessibility. With Granddad gone, my Nana could not safely live alone. From the time of the funeral through to the summer, we made a plan for family members to rotate through to stay with her until we could get her settled into assisted living. We considered having home health care come in, but we had tried that in the past, and she fired the nurses on more than one occasion. My turn to go to my grandparents' house came right at the start of summer. I went to visit her for 2 weeks right before her scheduled move to assisted living. My job, other than keeping her safe, was to help her start packing and deciding what furniture she wanted to move to her new apartment in assisted living. What I thought would be a simple task essentially turned my 2 weeks into a nightmare. I discovered my Nana is the world's most stubborn person. Each packing task turned into a fight, and she stated her plan was to refuse to move and that we couldn't make her. In approaching this situation with empathy, I understood that she was going through a huge amount of grief, both in losing her husband and in moving away from the house she's lived in for 40 years. Safety was our priority, but I did understand why she was upset about moving. Looking back, I realized this wasn't simply a matter of being stubborn or unwilling to move. Her motivation had been affected by both expectancy and value. The task felt emotionally overwhelming, and the emotional cost of leaving her home seemed much greater than the benefits of moving. Once I understood that, I knew I couldn't motivate her simply by telling her it needed to be done. I needed to change how she viewed the move. So, to increase her motivation, I focused on two specific strategies from expectancy value theory: increasing utility value and reducing perceived cost. First, I emphasized utility value by helping her focus on what she would gain rather than what she was losing. We talked about how moving would allow her to be closer to family and friends, receive additional support, and continue living safely while maintaining as much independence as possible. Instead of viewing the move as giving something up, she gradually began seeing it as an investment in her quality of life. At the same time, I worked to reduce the perceived cost. There were many trade-offs in this scenario, and making those clear to her, sharing the high cost of the situation made her finally start packing. The high cost of the situation did not center on her effort, but rather the effort of others on her behalf. I shared with her that while we all love coming down to stay with her a week or two at a time, in the long run that was not sustainable practice. She tried to share again that she could live alone in the house. We discussed how she had almost fallen multiple times in the time I had been there, and had I not been there to help catch her, she could have seriously injured herself. We discussed another reason against living alone is that she can't drive, and therefore cannot leave the house to get essentials like groceries. Then I shared that the stress she was placing on family members, particularly her sons, my dad and uncle, was causing their bodies to manifest the strain in physical ways. Since my granddad had always paid the bills, and my Nana does not really have the ability to, that task was taken over by my uncle. After looking at her finances, they were not doing so great with cash as we all as a family might have believed. Moving on an earlier timeline meant we could sell the house faster to support her in assisted living. My uncle had sat down to discuss this with her early on, but I reiterated that to her that her finances were not stable. Rather than expecting her to tackle everything alone, our family broke the move into smaller, manageable steps. We packed one room at a time, made decisions together, and reminded her that she wasn't facing the transition by herself. I'm grateful that near the end of the 2 weeks, my dad, my uncle, and my aunt were able to come help. These strategies didn't eliminate the sadness of leaving her home, but they made the process feel much more manageable. As the move became less overwhelming and more meaningful, her willingness to participate increased. Well, although this experience involved a family member, the same principles can be applied in our classrooms every day. One of the biggest lessons I learned is that students often aren't unmotivated because they're lazy. They're unmotivated because they either don't see value in the work or they believe the cost is too high. As teachers, we can increase motivation through expectancy value by helping students experience success through appropriate support and encouragement. We can increase utility value by explaining how learning connects to students' lives, interests, or future goals. We can also reduce costs by breaking larger assignments into smaller pieces, providing choices when appropriate, and creating an environment where mistakes are viewed as part of learning rather than something to fear. These strategies are especially important for diverse learners. English language learners, students with disabilities, our gifted students, and struggling learners may all experience value and cost differently. By recognizing those differences, we can adjust our instruction so that every student has the opportunity to feel capable, supported, and motivated. Now that we've explored how beliefs about success and value influence motivation, let's move to our second route stop, causal attribution theory. This helps explain how the reasons people assign to success and failure shape their future motivation. Our second route stop is causal attribution theory. While expectancy value theory asks whether a task is worth doing, causal attribution theory asks a different question. Why did this happen? According to Bernard Wiener, the explanations people give for success and failure influence how motivated they'll be in the future. In other words, it's often not the event itself that affects motivation, but the meaning we attach to that event. This theory is built around three dimensions. The first is locus of causality, which asks whether someone believes the cause came from within themselves or from something external. The second is stability, which asks whether the cause is permanent or temporary. For example, if a student believes they're just bad at math, they're viewing the problem as something stable or unlikely to change. On the other hand, if they believe they didn't do well because they didn't study enough, that cause is unstable because it's something they can change the next time. Finally, controllability focuses on whether the person believes they have any influence over changing the situation. As teachers, understanding these dimensions help us recognize that two students can experience the exact same outcome, but walk away with completely different levels of motivation, depending on how they explain what happened. So I got to experience implementing this theory firsthand while helping my dad after my grandfather passed away. In addition to grieving the loss of his father, my dad was suddenly faced with the responsibility of settling their estate. The number of decisions that needed to be made felt overwhelming, and as a result, his motivation to begin the process was very low. He was becoming impossible to talk to because of how grumpy he was being. He was lashing out at those around him, and completing each task was causing him to just shut down completely. He was verbal about how frustrated he was about my Nana's stubbornness, and he kept stating that he didn't want to help if she wasn't going to be open to the situation of moving. I know he was making this statement dramatically, and I thought it was interesting that the circumstances and how his mom approached the situation carried so much weight to how willing he was to be involved. Looking through the lens of causal attribution theory, I realized this wasn't simply procrastination. His thoughts about the situation were creating additional barriers. Everything felt permanent to him. It felt overwhelming and very much outside of his control. Before any progress could be made, those beliefs needed to change. Rather than simply encouraging my dad to get started or getting frustrated with him, I intentionally focused on two motivational strategies rooted in causal attribution theory. The first strategy was using a circle of control. This is an activity many elementary teachers already use with students. I know I use it in my own second grade classroom, but I realized it could also be helpful in this situation. Together, we identified what was outside of his control, such as losing his father, and what remained within his control, like organizing paperwork, making phone calls, and completing one task at a time. The second strategy was attribution retraining. Instead of allowing his internal dialogue to stay focused on thoughts like, this is too much, we worked towards replacing those thoughts with, I can focus on one step at a time. That small shift changed the situation from feeling impossible for him to feeling a bit more manageable. These strategies didn't remove the grief, but they helped restore a sense of control. Once he began viewing the situation differently, his motivation to move forward gradually increased. This experience taught me that attribution theory plays an important role in the classroom as well. Students are constantly explaining their own successes and failures. A student might say, I'm just bad at math, or I'm not a good reader. If those beliefs become stable and uncontrollable, motivation quickly decreases. Teachers have the opportunity to interrupt those patterns. We can encourage students to focus on effort, strategy, and persistence instead of believing that ability is fixed. Strategies like circle of control, growth mindset, and intentional teacher language all help students recognize what they can influence. Ultimately, our goal is to help students understand that while they can't control every outcome, they can always control how they respond, the strategies they choose, and the effort they make. So far, we've explored why people decide to engage in a task and how they explain success and failure. Our final route stop shifts the focus of the goals that drive learning and how those goals shape long term motivation. Our final route stop is goal orientation theory. Unlike the first two theories, which focus on why people choose to engage in a task or how they explain success and failure, goal orientation theory looks at the purpose behind learning. Generally, students approach learning with one of two types of goals. Students with mastery goals focus on learning, improving, and developing new skills. They tend to embrace challenges because mistakes are viewed as opportunities to grow. In contrast, students with performance goals are more focused on demonstrating their ability or earning recognition. Their motivation often comes from wanting to look successful or avoid looking unsuccessful. The readings also discussed approach and avoidance orientations. For example, a mastery approach student wants to learn something new, while a performance avoidant student may simply want to avoid failing or appearing less capable than others. As teachers, our goal shouldn't be to eliminate performance goals completely. Instead, we want to create classroom environments where mastery goals become the primary focus because they encourage persistence, resilience, and love of learning. Unlike my first two acts of motivation, I didn't have the opportunity to apply goal orientation theory. However, I started thinking about how I could use it in the future. The next step in my family's journey is going to be holding an estate sale. Everyone involved is coming into that process with different emotions, different priorities, and different ideas about what success looks like. If we approach the situation with a performance mindset, success might simply mean finishing as quickly as possible or getting the highest profit. But if we approach it with a mastery mindset, the focus would shift towards working together, learning the process, solving problems as they arise, and supporting one another through a difficult time for our family. Thinking about this scenario helped me realize that goal orientation theory isn't just for classrooms. It can shape the way people approach almost any challenging experience. This theory has probably influenced my future teaching more than any other concept we've discussed this semester. I want to create a classroom where students measure success by their own growth rather than comparing themselves to others. One way I can do that is through progress portfolios, which allow students to see how much they've improved over time. I also want to intentionally use growth mindset language, praising effort, strategy, and persistence instead of simply telling students they're smart. Goal setting is another important strategy because it gives students ownership of their learning. Finally, providing meaningful choices helps students feel more invested and confident in the work they're doing. These strategies create a classroom culture where learning becomes the goal. I learned a lot about grief this summer, but I learned more about motivation. As I reflect on this course and my acts of motivation, I've realized that each theory answers a different question about motivation. Expectancy value theory reminds us that students need to believe learning is worthwhile. If they don't see value in what they're doing, motivation will naturally decline. Causal attribution theory reminds us that students are constantly interpreting success and failure. As teachers, we have the opportunity to help students develop healthier, more productive ways of thinking about challenges. Finally, goal orientation theory reminds us that the type of classroom we create influences the type of learners our students become. When we emphasize growth, effort, and improvement, we help students develop motivation that lasts beyond a single assignment. The biggest lesson I've learned from this project is that motivation doesn't come from one strategy or conversation. It comes from understanding the person in front of you and choosing the strategy that best meets their needs. Thank you for unpacking these theories with me. I hope these theories and strategies encourage you to look beyond student behavior and instead ask a more important question. What does the student need in order to move forward?